let's get on this topic, though. This is a really interesting one that I wasn't aware of. I used to do articles for CapeCod.com, which is a local website. I did a lot of history pieces for that. And so in doing that, I had to come up with interesting topics that readers would want to hear about. And this one was one that I had no idea about. But enough about kind of the anticipation. Let's get into it. People misplace things all the time. You can misplace your wallet, your keys. You can misplace a photo album, clothing, something like that where you totally forget where it was. And then days, months, years down the road, it shows back up. And you can't believe, like, oh my God, I can't believe that I didn't remember where I had put this object. So this subject today is maybe one of the largest misplaced objects that you could possibly have, and that's a lighthouse. This is a story of how a lighthouse could be misplaced for decades while actually residing alive and well somewhere far, far away. In 1838, a lighthouse station was established at Mayo Beach in Wellfleet. Mayo Beach is on the bay side of the Cape, right next to Wellfleet Harbor. It was named Mayo Beach for the Mayo family, which had helped to settle Wellfleet in the mid-17th century. The lighthouse station was designated there because people thought it would be useful in the fishing and whaling industry and helping guide vessels into the harbor. This was the second lighthouse station in Wellfleet. The first one was the one on Billingsgate Island, which I spoke about in episode 2. So if you want to go back and hear about the first lighthouse in Wellfleet, check out podcast episode 2 and Cape Cod's Atlantis. Despite the best intentions, the lighthouse and the keeper's house, the whole situation was a disaster. Essentially, the lighthouse was short and wooden, and the keeper's house was built below sea level. So the lighthouse and the home would constantly flood. Despite the terrible conditions, the lighthouse remained virtually unchanged for over 40 years. Eventually, though, it was rebuilt in 1881. It was a classic cast iron tower and a new house, a more adequate house to replace the one that was below sea level. Cast iron lighthouse towers are basically the norm now. The ones that aren't, that are either granite or stone, those are seen as more unique. But for the most part, cast iron towers are kind of what you see that from this era of the 1880s to the end of the 19th century. This second incarnation of Mayo Beach Light remained in service for another 4 decades, but eventually it was decommissioned in 1922. There were bids put in on the lighthouse itself, which was won by Captain Harry Capron. So he won the bidding at auction for the lighthouse, and the lighthouse was dismantled. And basically that was the end of the story as far as it went on Cape Cod here. The lighthouse was dismantled and it's gone. That's it. Mayo Beach Light is no more. Incredibly, for 80 years, more than 80 years, that was the belief, that Mayo Beach Lighthouse had been purchased, dismantled, and just disposed of. That was far from the reality, though. Incredibly, in 2008, a woman named Colleen McNenny, her parents Bob and Sandra Shanklin, had photographed every lighthouse in the country. She was working on digitally archiving the photographs in the U.S. Coast Guard historian's office, and she came across a strangely captioned old photo. The photo was dated 1927, and the caption read, "This tower formerly used at Mayo Beach, 2nd District." What was the location of that lighthouse? A place called Yerba Buena, California, more commonly known as San Francisco. An unbelievable shock that Mayo Beach Lighthouse had not only been dismantled back in the 20s on Cape Cod, but it had been shipped from Wellfleet to the West Coast and reassembled, and it is still standing today. Today it's called Point Montara Lighthouse. Point Montara Lighthouse, formerly Mayo Beach Lighthouse, was erected in 1928 and replaced the skeleton tower that had been built out there on the cliffs in 1912. In a funny and roundabout way, basically Montara, which lies 20 miles south of San Francisco. So it's like a suburb. When I say San Francisco, it's like suburbs of Boston around here. So it's not really San Francisco. But anyway, the town of Montara and Wellfleet, they're like parents that got divorced and they have custody of a child, except this child is a lighthouse. There's a keeper's house next to Point Montara Lighthouse. It's a 50-bed youth hostel and is visited by thousands of people yearly. If you didn't know the story, you'd look at that lighthouse and it's no different than any of the other hundreds and hundreds of lighthouses in America and the thousands in the world. Back on Cape Cod, though, in Wellfleet, the keeper's house that was rebuilt in 1881, that still stands. You can actually go, there's postcards of Mayo Beach Lighthouse from back then, and you can go get a similar photo from the similar vantage point, and it all looks the same except the tower isn't there anymore. And sadly, Mayo Beach Light and Billingsgate Island Light are both gone, and there's really nothing left of them. You couple that with the famed Chequesset Inn, which stood about a half mile from Mayo Beach Lighthouse, and there are these 3 giant pieces of Wellfleet history that are all lost, and they all have interesting stories. Billingsgate Island, Mayo Beach Lighthouse, Chequesset Inn. It's incredible what used to be on Cape Cod, and that's why I find history so interesting, is there are these things, you walk these places. Mayo Beach still exists. If you didn't know the story, you wouldn't know there was a lighthouse there ever. It's just a nice beach. It faces Great Island and Jeremy Point out in Wellfleet. Cape Cod and places in New England, a lot of them have sister cities across the pond in the United Kingdom. Barnstable, Falmouth, Yarmouth, they're all named after places in England. And I find it interesting that this little town of Montara is actually, in a roundabout way, a sister city of Wellfleet, because they share Mayo Beach Light, Point Montara Light. They're the same thing, just on opposite coasts of America. If you want to learn a little more about Point Montara Light, you can get some info from lighthousefriends.com. That's a pretty good site. hiusa.org. That's more of a hostel site, so you can see the youth hostel, and it's got some photos of the lighthouse. If you go, there's a site called Digital Commonwealth, and that's run by the state of Massachusetts, Boston Public Library. They have incredible old photos. That has photos of Mayo Beach Lighthouse from when it was in Wellfleet also. And Digital Commonwealth is a site that you can just go and, as I call it, well, everyone calls it, go down the rabbit hole. You start looking for one thing, it brings up suggestions, and before you know it, you've spent a couple hours looking at old photos from Massachusetts from the last couple of 100 years. But that's the story of Mayo Beach Lighthouse, the lighthouse that was lost, technically, for 80 years, although it existed 3,000 miles away near San Francisco, California.